That was fantastic. Thank you so much. But when you were talking about that overgeneral memory, and the way that affects being able to draw on detail for for futures, and you had that lovely example of the conference, and people knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
One of the things that really struck me is how prevalent for our children disrupted placement is, and I'm just wondering, what the impact do you think of continuous disruption in the care process is in terms of this aspect of autobiographical memory?
I think that's a really, really brilliant question, because what you're saying is that it's not that these kids are simply different in terms of how they're processing their memories, it's that the memories they have to process are also really different, because most of us have been lucky enough to be in the same family, in the same house for most of our childhood, and these children are having to have often multiple placement changes of caregiver or changes of professionals in their lives. So in a way it becomes a double whammy. So not only is the system in itself less able to develop an effective way to record past experience and negotiate the future, the complexity of that past experience is also incredibly complicated, and more complicated than for most typically developing kids. So that probably is an additive effect to make it even more difficult for that child to effectively negotiate social problems.
Maintaining placements is a really, really high priority.
Most of the time, placements break down for the wrong reasons. I mean, that it would be better to sustain placement stability. So there's a lot of evidence that that's the case, and that kids do better when placements are stable. Because when you have a placement breakdown, as you know, it just makes it more likely that that happens again. You know, we know from the attachment side that that leads to all kinds of difficulties for the child in losing trust in others, and has a real meaning for them when the placement breaks down and they have to move on. So placement stability is absolutely central.
I'm very curious about learning a wee bit more about children who are living in poverty. And I know you mentioned that in your research, the children who were identified by social services were matched. And I just wondered if you could tell us a bit about any differences that are socioeconomic in nature.
Because of how research works, we haven't been really able to address in our work, because reviewers, when we publish, will say, well, how do you know this has got to do with maltreatment rather than socioeconomic status? So we match on socioeconomic status, and we recruit children from the same areas, the same schools, so that isn't a confound. But we know that poverty is a risk factor as well. And so there are animal studies, for example, that show that when mums in particular are stressed because foraging for food becomes unpredictable or stressful, that makes it less able for them to regulate the stress in their offspring. So that poverty introduces unpredictability in the environment for the parents, which compromises their ability to parent and to regulate the child's own stress. So there's part of the piece is in relation to that, but part of it is also in relation to deprivation and the absence of the stimulation and the richness of the environment that can result from a poor or poverty characterized environment. So it can affect the parenting, because a parent wants to do well for their kids. If they don't have enough money, that's stressful. They're preoccupied by trying to be a good parent and get the resources that they need. But the focus on the physical resources can then compromise their ability to parent the child's needs. But there also is evidence of deprivation effects in terms of the environment being less stimulating or rich. So both of those are relevant. So they're very related to the experiences of maltreatment, and in some ways related to what we're learning about neglect, in that when you have deprivation in an environment, it can have quite a broad set of impacts. Rather than, say, on threat processing with physical abuse, there's an absence of stimulation across the board in ways that can have global effects for outcome. So there are studies, neuroscience studies, that have looked at poverty in particular, and the effects are quite profound. And you're right that these children are often experiencing both. And that again sets up major difficulties. And what we're seeing are changes that are not to do with the poverty. And in a way, what we're missing in that set of studies is what the poverty would be adding on top, because we're controlling it out. So we're actually only giving a slightly optimistic picture of what these kids are actually experiencing.